Welcome everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.
Right, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Rambo, who is a veteran Counter-Strike player from North America. Now, one thing that's going to be interesting here, Ronald, is obviously people who are old school might know I wrote a guide with you to CS. It was called The Art of CS. I'll put like a link in the description below. I'll just put it on like one of those free hosting sites. Everyone can download it. And also, over the years, especially in the old school, I've done many interviews with you before, so we've talked about most of the topics we're probably going to talk about now. But the key thing is, a lot of that stuff we talked about, 2 or 3 years after it happened or 5 years after it happened. It's 20 years after that now, Ronald. Like, I feel like the reflections part might heavily come into play here. Is it wild to think back at how long a career ago it was you had that career and how long esports has been on? It must be, you're a real old school guy, so what's it like for you?
Yeah, I'm 40 now, so it's been 2 lifetimes since we met and since esports started, to see how much it's grown, the explosion of the community, the tournament prizes, the skill level. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, these players these days are just infinitely better than we were back then, obviously. So evolved. So it's just amazing to see. And it's really no surprise that gaming has become what it has become.
One thing I thought we could do that would make it different, like I say from those past interviews, is the era when you came up in Counter-Strike and esports was so radically different to what people think of as esports now. I thought at the beginning we could almost do, when I ask you the questions, almost like, one of those like oral histories of like such and such. Essentially, we were there. So I want to ask you a few questions to set the scene for people. So first of all, if people don't know, you really were competing from almost like day one in Counter-Strike, right? Like, you remember that famous thing that Ksharp used to always say, which he always used to brag about what his one ID was, because his one ID was, like 1,000 or something ridiculous. Like, it implied that he had like a super low. I'm guessing you were also someone who basically had like one of the first accounts and was like, you were in basically the earliest teams possible, right?
Yeah, funny enough, I literally played Counter-Strike the first day it came out, Beta 1. I was landing with my friends in high school, and one of my friends worked for IGN. And he's like, hey, we should download this game called Counter-Strike. So, it took us like 8 hours on our 56K modem all night. We woke up the next day and we just all fell in love. And, we had a group of like 5 to 10 players that would always land. So after we downloaded Counter-Strike, that's just like the only game we played. So I literally played from Beta 1. And one of my friends had the digit 6.
That's it. It wasn't like 6 something. It was just 6. Right?
Literally
okay.
6.
That's pretty
digit,
good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Okay. By the way, along these lines, an obvious thing I should ask you about knowing a little bit about your life is, I'll give you an example. When I did one of these interviews with Bombs, your obvious teammate in later teams, I did ask him the obvious question, which is, if you think of what a lot of the like Asian second or third generation immigrant kids were like in CS, a lot of them actually were more sort of like the bad kids. They were like all those people, I won't say the teams, but all those West Coast teams that were always in like those SoCal lands where the joke I always had was, instead of joining a gang, they just played CS at the LAN party or something. Like, they just went to those LAN cafes and they kind of were like sort of like the bad boys. I always felt like you were obviously more in the Bombs category of like, you're supposed to be the good boys. Well, I bet your parents are telling you to like, get all your homework done and stuff. So here's the question, Ronald. How did you manage to go to all these LANs? Like, was it not a problem? Did they not ask what you're doing all weekend? Are you doing was it not an issue? I'm sure your parents must have really cared about that stuff, right?
Sure, yeah. I think with most Asian parents, they want you to follow the traditional route. But I got super lucky, and I think that played a big role in my ability to practice. So yeah, they would definitely like hide my keyboard, and I would have to right. find it and then like hide it back when they came home. And
okay.
My grades definitely did suffer, and that could be because I was staying up, or I just wasn't interested in school. But yeah, I got lucky. I mean, once I started attending local LAN events and making money, they were all on board, and they saw how passionate I was, and I was getting some success. I was getting all these experiences traveling. So, and another part too, as a single child, so my parents were often at work. So
right.
The computer was kind of my babysitter, and it kept me home and it kept me safe. So I think that was kind of another reason they allowed me to do it.
Another thing I always wanted to ask you is, I feel like surely for you, being a professional in Counter-Strike must almost feel like fate. Because if people don't know, in the early few years of Counter-Strike, it was only European teams had sponsors, and even then a lot of them didn't have much. Maybe it was just the plane flight was covered. But famously in North America, even the top teams, pretty much everyone did almost pay their own way there. They just hoped they won prize money. Well, if people don't know, Ronald basically lived in exactly the area that was like the mecca of Counter-Strike at the time. Like, all those CPLs were really close to where you were. And in fact, one thing a lot of people might not know is, even when it wasn't CPL, there used to be those like lethal gamer tournaments that were like every month in the same area. And at the time, it wasn't like it was just like the local teams. Those were the top NA teams, like the top 3 to 4 teams in NA at the time were basically all local to Texas and went to these lands, right? It feels like you were basically in the most perfect place. Like, this is the equivalent of if someone was born in the 1960s in like Berkeley or something, like they're going to be a part of all that stuff with like the LSD in the party. Do you feel as though like it was almost fate you were supposed to be a CS player?
Yeah, 100%. For sure, there's a lot of luck involved. So, I lived in Dallas, Texas. It was the headquarters of ID Software, who made Quake. So they used to run a bunch of international events in Dallas. So that was my first experience with local LAN tournaments. It's just like a 40-minute drive. And that's where all the best players flew down. They had a LAN party with like bring your own computer tournaments there. So, yeah, super lucky. It's just a quick drive to experience that. And not, when you're a young kid, teenager, you don't have money to travel, hotel, gas, and all that. So super lucky in that aspect where I was grown. And then in addition to the headquarters for the CPL, the Cyber Athlete Professional League, which was also headquartered in Dallas, and that's who kind of birthed Counter-Strike and had official events. So a lot of luck involved. Also, being central in Dallas, Texas, I had good internet. So I had good ping. And most of the time, internet matches were localized in Texas because East Coast, West Coast. So it was literally the perfect situation. A lot of luck involved for sure.
One of the other things that might shock people about this era, because funnily enough, me and you were similar age. At the time, we were the Zoomers of esports. Like, you remember back then, most of the people who played games like CS or Quake were actually sort of like 30-year-old guys, because you had to have your own PC, your own internet connection. You had to be able to travel and go to the LAN. And so I remember what's funny is, if people know the early teams that Ronald was in, like Syndicate and Clan Killers and stuff, actually a lot of these teams were like older guys who were doing this as like their fun thing. And I remember they even used to describe people like you and Ksharp as like, they were like the up and comers. They were like the kids who were around, and like we knew they were skilled, but like they were like our star players. What was the scene like back then? Like, did you remember, did you fit in? Was it people like you? What was early CS like?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, back then it was like, I got my first computer. It was a 200 megahertz PC Intel. And it was $2,000 that my dad got me. So it was not cheap to get into computers back then. It was just a new technology. As well as the internet. If you had like maybe, a school T1 line, you could get good ping. DSL and cable wasn't as available, around yet. So definitely was like, I had to money to get involved and get the equipment. So, but yeah, I mean, I got, I was always interested in video games. I would go to like the farmer's market with my parents. They would give me a bunch of quarters and I would go to the arcade, and I started getting like fighting game magazines to learn combos, and that was when I was like 7 years old. So I always had this passion for competitive video games, and then so I got that experience early on of what it takes to kind of learn and how to beat people, counter strategies. So I guess once we started attending these local LAN events, there were like a much older crowd. So there's a huge advantage there. But now, I mean, you see Tens and Donk. I mean, they've got like 10,000 hours before they're 17.
It's amazing, isn't it?
They're already like elite tier 1 level, so they've got a massive advantage.
Another thing that was actually quite interesting about this era, like I set up with all the local LANs and the fact that you were where basically the biggest LAN in Counter-Strike, the CPL, took place, is your era of players also never had that thing, especially in your case, of ever being like, you're online. Like, you basically were on LAN from almost day one. Like, I always felt like that must have been an advantage, because you remember what those first few years were like. When CPL used to be like 2 per year for the big ones, there were players in CPL Invite who were good players, but they just had no LAN experience, and you knew when they got to the LAN, I won't mention names, they'd probably fail. Did you always feel like you were sort of vetted? Like, you were there from the LANs from basically day one, right?
100%. And again, like Dallas was the mecca of esports, and there was a lot of LAN centers. So there was a lot of tournaments we can attend weekly. So I forget the names of them, but you put in $20, 10, 15 teams may show up. So from early on, I had all this LAN experience, being able to set up on new computers and just like that whole energy and added pressure, I suppose, playing in person, not being on your own chair, all that kind of stuff. So in addition to my friends, my homies in high school, like we would LAN every weekend. We would just invade a parent's house. We'd have 5 people, 10 people sometimes, and play 2-on-2, 3-on-3s. And, being able to play on low ping was also a huge advantage. I could kind of cater my game around that.
Obvious question to ask. How good were you back then? In the early days, do you think you were good? Like, did you get good quick?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I was just super passionate. Obviously, I put in a lot of time. And then just with my local friends, I eventually found out I was the best. But they were amazing too, so they helped my development. I mean, they were all great. I mean, Sickness and Riot Squad, that whole crew there. I mean, they were, top 10, 15 teams. So got to develop with those guys. And then once my first time I got my first big success was when I went to CPL. It was a QuakeCon. It was like the first BYOC Counter-Strike tournament.
All right.
It was a 64-person one-on-one on Mansion. And I ended up winning that, playing one of my LAN friends in the finals. So won a video card, which is like a huge upgrade for me. And then from there, I was like, okay, well, this is awesome. I love this. I'm gonna keep pursuing it.
I want to get your take on something, because I wonder if in North America it was like it was on the European side. If I ever do interviews with the really old school Europeans like HeatoN or Potti or the people who played the game online and stuff, they all tell me something which I found quite similar in early Counter-Strike, which is when you had the first LANs come along. Like I said before, it's not just that some people were onliners and didn't have LAN experience. There would also be situations where, cause like online play just wasn't that serious, you'd get teams that would go to these like proper CPL LANs trying to win money. And the great players from Europe tell me it wasn't really till you got to the LAN that usually you'd realize, like, oh, dude, like 2 players on my team actually low-key sort of suck, but I didn't know. And it would basically be like at the tournament, it's more like you could just see who the ballers were. Like, oh, these 2 guys are really good, or oh, fuck that one AWP over there. And it's more like the LAN people, you could see immediately who was good, but you could also sort of see who was sort of like didn't live up to the bill. Was it like that in the early NA scene when you were on some of these early teams?
For sure. I mean, I think that's the case for some people. They either strive with that pressure or they let it get to them. And obviously a lot of experience, like the more you're on stage, the more you get used to it. But me personally, I mean, I absolutely loved it. I felt that was like the most fun. It's where like, this is where all the preparation and practice time comes to. And I definitely, it exhilarated me, it gave me energy. And I just absolutely loved it. So that's where you could kind of showcase your skill set. And luckily for me, I had a lot of teammates that some struggled, some did amazing, and you would keep the amazing players. And I was able to surround myself with some of the best players in the world. Obviously, Ksharp, absolute killer, best sniper in the world. Thank goodness I didn't have to play versus him.
Sure.
So some of the some strategic masterminds and like moto bombs, great captains, and just amazing people. So you figure out with enough practice time, especially even just online, like who is smart. Like you could just innately see, okay, this guy's intelligent, they don't make mistakes, they're clutch, they have good communication. You see all the skill sets that you would want to play with, and when you go to LAN, that's where it really matters. So I had some absolute killers on my team.
Oh, yeah. I'll actually ask about some of these players, because obviously in the interview I was going to anyway, so now's a good time, right? If I ask you about Ksharp, first things first, just give me, what were the early experiences like? Because if people don't know, he's kind of a bit of a strange guy himself. What was it like to meet Ksharp? And he has a very weird sense of humor. Who is this guy?
Yeah, Ksharp, I mean, he has a heart of gold. Fun fact is that like both of his parents are like high, like they were in the CIA.
Yeah,
so
it's like some really crazy shit, right? Like
so he himself, he's super smart. He had like a black belt when he was like 8 years old. And the first time I met him, it was at a CPL, and we played one-on-one on this map called Speedball for like 4 hours. And he's the only ever guy that went toe-to-toe with me. And I was just like, man, this guy's insane. So from there, he kind of, all the credibility was kind of approved, I suppose, from my standpoint. And then, when it got to land in matches, like he was just fearless. He was it's the opposite of his personality. He's just like super aggressive, takes map control. Like he just has this force, especially with a sniper, right? So he created so much space. He got a lot of pickoffs. You wouldn't have to worry about him. He was just a big playmaker.
It's funny you said that line that like you're just glad you didn't have to play against him and he's your teammate, because actually that I do think that's a classic concept from sports. Like I can tell you in CS:GO and CS 1.6, that's what basically Forrest and Get Right told me. They were like, when I saw how good the other guy was, I was like, why don't we just play together our whole careers? Like, what's the point in us like splitting up and battling each other? Why don't we just play together and win everything? Like in the early days, if people don't know, like especially in those early versions of Counter-Strike before the game got like a little bit less like individually focused, I remember when people like you and Ksharp played, it's like you could have won the game on your own. So like having both of you together, did you have that sense of like we should just stay together? Like this is the guy I should hitch my wagon to, as it were? Did you have that sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's the one that I probably played the most with in the most matches. And it's kind of interesting because our play styles are really different. I'm more of like a passive player, lurker. I like late round situations. I don't like taking those kind of 50-50 aim duels, so I didn't have the best aim. So, he was like early game kind of player, take map control, get pickoffs, and then I usually had the bomb, so I was in a lot of clutch situations, in inning round situations. So I think it was a good contrast, and I think that was a good reason for bringing some balance to the team. Yeah.
People might know a famous thing about Ksharp. I even knew him, so he even told me cynically he did this, is he didn't release many demos because he understood how big he was. And so he said he only ever released a demo if it was like totally insane and like every clip, because he said what's the point in releasing like a normal demo when the hype's like that. But as a result, I've got to ask you this obvious question, Rambo, which is, I've heard that in scrims though, Ksharp is just ridiculous and that he's just doing like stuff that would like melt your brain if a fan saw it, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about just pure mechanics, I mean, him with the Deagle and an op were just overpowered. Like his Deagle was an op, and back then you could bunny hop, and his movement was insane. His first bullet accuracy. So I mean, I would just sit there and just, I wouldn't even have to do anything most of the time, right? Like he would just win rounds single handedly. So. Like I said, he's definitely, all the Counter-Strike players I play, definitely put him top 5, top 10 mechanically gifted. And there's that like infamous train demo that he released,
sure.
One of the few, and he just went absolutely insane. So yeah, I mean, it's an absolute pleasure playing with him, watching it every single day. I couldn't say enough good things about him.
The one last question I would have about him, but I'll expand it out to be more about, so it's not just picking on him, just general teammates. One problem he had, I can tell you, as someone who knew him and knows the history of Counter-Strike is, he would even tell you himself, he was the guy that like did it. He was like the stories people say about Shaq, where like if Shaq had actually wanted to be like the best ever, he probably could have been. Like if he'd have stayed in shape all the time and trained in the off season, like if he'd have been like Michael Jordan or Kobe, he probably would be the best player ever because he had that insane raw talent, right? But everyone knows Shaq's whole thing was like, I'm sort of like really great anyway, and I can sort of have fun and play. It's actually quite a good analogy because obviously Ksharp famously played like 1 billion hours of EverQuest and fucking World of Warcraft and Dota also. Every other game except CS, this guy played 1 billion hours. So the obvious question with him is, I feel like he would admit he didn't maximize his talent all the years of his career. Maybe early on he played a lot, but I would say in general that's a problem you often had in those 3D teams, Ronald, which is, I got the sense you played loads. I know Ogni and Steel played loads, maybe Bullseye when he was there. There's certain players did their hours they needed to, but there are certain players, and surely Ksharp's among them, where like they maybe just had a few months where they didn't play that much, or they only played the scrims and the officials. How did you handle that? Because I know actually, despite what your parents might think about your schoolwork, in game you were a very diligent player, Rambo. You always kept your hours up. You always had your skill sharp. How did you handle when teammates maybe weren't as dedicated as you?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the thing with Ksharp is, he's a gamer, so he loves other games too. So he did, he was just, obviously he put in the hours to get to his talent level.
Yes.
But he wasn't like the Mamba mentality, that Kobe mentality where he's in the gym 2 or 3 hours a day. So he didn't do the extra hours that would have made him like probably one of the best. But he also, he's a easy laid back type of person. He's not like a forcer. He's not a grinder, albeit he, like I said, he already put in the time. So where me, I felt like I probably wasn't as naturally talented as Ksharp. So I did have to put in the hours. So, we would have team practice, 5 days a week, play 5 or 6 hours a day. And then after team practice, I would play pickup games. So I started a kind of NA North America pro pickup channel in IRC days. And from like 11 a.m. to 6 a.m., this is where we do 10-man pickups where we would play with all the best players. You pick 2 captains, and then first 10 to join, we would play teams. So I would play practice time and then the additional practice time afterwards. And that was why I was able to, keep up. So, but yeah, Ksharp, he didn't have that Mamba mentality. If he did, he could be like, I mean, he's still one of the greatest of all times, but it's crazy to think how much better he could have been if he wasn't grinding in EverQuest.
Yes. And then I'll ask about some of your other teammates. So if people remember in the X3 days, a big name appropriately was the player BigDog. And I remember actually back then, a lot of players told me they thought he was actually the best player at this time. He had like a really well-rounded game. If everyone remembers, I actually know this guy as well. He also is one of those people who was way ahead of everyone, Rambo, on using like the insanely low sensitivity, like in this era. It took a few years before people started doing like the big mouse, but he actually was one of the first ones to do that. I don't know if he saw Fatality do it or something, but basically this guy actually, I remember he was like really early. He was very good, right? What would you say about this player? Because obviously he didn't play in later teams, Team 3D. Who was this guy?
Yeah, this guy, his name's Ray, BigDog. He was from Texas. When we formed X3, he came from this clan called CK3. And before then, I didn't really know him, but he got merged in with some of our teammates as a voucher. And when I started playing with this guy, I mean, he was the most insane rifler in North America by far. And I mean, just, multi kills, just a clean, efficient aim, never had to worry about a skill set. And then we played that famous match at CPL, X3
one, right?
versus Nip
Yep.
on Nuke. And I think we lost on the second map on by the last round, but he would hold outside on Nuke on CT side. And I remember like the first 2 gun rounds, Potti would go outside and we just hear one bullet AK tap and he died. Like he just got picked off. And I was like, who's Potti? He's taking out our best player. And unfortunately he didn't do so well in that match. And I think after that, it kind of got to him mentally and he kind of just stepped away from the game. But it's unfortunate, but he was literally the most mechanically gifted player in terms of rifling that I've ever seen, with low sense, super precise, crosshair placement, all that. He was definitely ahead of his time.
Along those lines, let's set up the context for that match. If people don't know, at the time, that was, for a long time, the most famous Counter-Strike match ever, because even though, funnily enough, it was actually sort of the first real major, it was just such an epic match because the storyline was like something out of an anime. Like you had NIP were over in Europe and they were winning all their lands, but they crucially didn't go to the CPL, Speakeasy CPL early on that your X3 team won. And then X3 with a slightly different lineup was over in NA winning all the NA lands. And these two like unbeatable, it was literally like, the irresistible force meets the immovable object, that like famous meme cliche that everyone does. But what was great about this tournament, I remember, Ronald, was not only was the prize money huge, so there was no excuses, everyone wanted to win this one LAN and everyone was practicing for it, but even better, because of this build-up where the teams were split into different regions, you got to do the cool thing where every European fan could be like, no, NIP would win if they came, and then all the NA fans could be like, no, hey, X3, Ksharp will beat you and all. And I always get the vibe, didn't the players themselves kind of buy into this? Like, oh, you guys thought you were going to win this CPL, right? And win the 50K?
Yeah. So at that point, this was the largest first prize ever. It was $50,000, and this was the first big major. And the finals match, it ended up being an IP from Sweden, and then our team from North America. And it was like the first time the superpowers, I guess, from each region played each other. And we didn't really know who each other was. We never played versus each other.
Yes.
But we obviously knew like they had a reputation. So, it was this huge lead up, and it was the first time that superpowers were able to play for each other. Just insane match, came down to the last round. It was like everything I guess the fans and the communities could have hoped for. And they beat us, and it was, definitely like if there could be one match I could win, it would be that one.
Of course.
Yeah. So that one hurt, but they played really well. And then, of course, that kind of core would keep continuing on and dominating, and so would we. So it was just an amazing match, and it was great to be a part of that.
I even have a piece of trivia, which when I remind you, you will remember, but sadly it's quite triggering. But it'll just show people how scoffed esports back then was. So even though, Ronald, we're talking about a tournament with $50,000 for first place, it's the first like world championship. This was even one actually that technically Valve even called like they allowed CPL to call it like the world championship. HeatoN told me this years ago. And basically, even though that's the case, the game itself was so boggy. There's two details. One, that was the era, if you remember, where like sometimes you couldn't even use smokes on nuke because they would just lag you when you went up that ladder. And so teams just had an agreement to not use them. And the worst one is in the match you're talking about, which everyone remembers was like overtime or 13-11 or whatever it was. It was like the closest possible margin. I remember the game ended with someone like firing at a diffusing player. And it was that thing where there was no head hitbox from behind. And so you couldn't kill them with a D. I can't remember who was firing. If it was you, BigDog, whoever it was that was doing this shot. So like people might not realize this, but back then, my actual bogs could literally just decide the game. Like CS was wild back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was still in development.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things. I mean, like even then, people didn't know what console commands were.
Yeah,
so people
absolutely. All the interp shit, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, interp commands and stuff. So it was it's a whole new kind of space. There weren't really any rules set. It was the whole industry in itself was in development. So. Yeah, I mean, there was like that flash bug in a ramp room where you could like drop in under that box and it would blind the whole map. Yeah,
that lasted like 10 years. That was like 10 years we had that, yeah.
Yeah.
What about, so in the early days, another player that you played with who didn't go on, so I just want to ask about this player now, was actually the person who, if people remember, replaced Moto when he left. It was obviously Chameleon was his alias, but Porter was his surname. Obviously, people might know because he used the surname. So who was this player? Because I always remember this guy. He was a big personality, but he was a pretty good player too. Like he was clearly a LAN player as well.
Yeah, so he was actually a foster child of Frank Nuccio. His alias is Sith. Frank was one of the people that were responsible for starting CPL. So Porter, Chameleon, he lived in Dallas, and I LANed with him. So he lived local, and I would LAN at his place frequently. And this guy was a mastermind. He was ahead of his time. So I would sleep, I would wake up, and he'd have notes of all these strats and nades he found. And I was like, holy crap, I've never even thought about that. And he's just found the most insane flashes. Like there was this flash on Prodigy. When you go through the door and then like there's this computer room there that people would sit behind. It's like an unbreakable spot. It's like the most OP angle. And he found this flash that like banked off the top right edge of the door. It would hit the window and pop flash above someone's head. That would end up winning us a round. I would use that round. So this guy was like Napoleon, and he would, just found all these angles and nades and lineups. And back then, like nade lineups weren't really a thing. You could just throw it on the fly. But he would just sit there for hours and just find all these intricate nades. And, he was a very, very smart person and, just a tactical genius.
One of the things I always found really interesting back in the day was there was like a drama, but because of that, there wasn't like many esports sites, and definitely there wasn't like coverage like you have now with people writing big articles and stuff. Back then, people never knew the behind the scenes drama, Rambo. So one of the coolest storylines in this era, these couple of years, was the one where Moto was in 3D with X3, sorry, with you and all these players, and you were the top team. And then I heard the story went, because at the time, like all the roles in the game weren't really set. People were just good players and they just played the game. As the roles started to get set, obviously, famously, Moto did think of himself as an in-game leader. He wanted to be like the quarterback, as it were, And I heard in the early teams, basically, you guys didn't want that because, you were just like the all-star team. Like, well, we don't need you to do it. I've heard basically like people like BigDog told me, we don't fucking need you as the leader, mate. If you don't like it, just go fuck off, basically. And he did. He obviously went to Domain of Pain first and tried to make a rival team. People remember later he had TSO, which obviously was actually pretty good. And eventually, he did come back in 3D and you guys did reunite and he did become the in-game leader. So what I would ask is this. In the early days, the results would say he was wrong. You guys were still awesome without him. His teams weren't as good initially. They didn't win the LANs or anything. Later on, maybe this was the case. What did you think of this? Were you involved with this drama? Did you agree? What did you think? Did he want to kind of be the leader?
Yeah, so he played for a team called TSO, and Kane was one of his teammates. And they went like 16-1 in like online Cal League.
Yes. And
just super impressive. And then, somehow, I don't know who made the introduction, but they joined us, Kane and Moto. And the reason why I respected Moto so much was because he played Half-Life Deathmatch as well as Kane, and that was at the time, in my opinion, the most skillful game possible.
Yeah,
and he was phenomenal. So that mechanically, I knew, okay, this guy's a gamer.
right.
So once he joined, he has a very structured way of playing. So it's not as loose and cowboy style that we had played before, where people would play on feel and intuition. You would just figure it out on the fly. So he'd very structured, very set strats, which was actually kind of helpful. So we had a lot of success with him. We won a lot of tournaments. And then I think after a few years, that kind of system wasn't working anymore. So it was getting too stiff and too rigid, where you were taking out that intuition that, of the freedom that people could have in game. And so that's where kind of eventually I felt like it wasn't working anymore. So that's when we needed to make a change. And that's, eventually after a few years, we did that.
Since I set the scene earlier that you were basically like someone who was proven on LAN from the very beginning because you were playing on LAN in the first CS tournaments and you had loads of LAN experience and you were a top player, I always wanted to know, when it came to that 2002 year and the team had broken up and you made Team 3D, in both of the iterations, the one that you had with De Beers and Jaden, famously, you guys finished like 17th at that CPL, which at the time was like unthinkable. Like top players like you, like a bad performance would have been coming like 4th or something, The idea of coming 17th wasn't even possible. And then right after that, if you remember with the American lineup with Kane and Moto, you guys went to that World Cyber Games and again, you just came like 7th to 8th. Like, even though these might not sound like a big deal to players now because people have up and down results. Like I say, back then, if you were the top teams, the game was very structured. Like, you didn't get like the 9th best team beat the 2nd best team. It was quite, the hierarchy was quite set. Was it a big shock to you to go to some of these lands and to basically be irrelevant or not be able to win the tournament? Was it a big deal?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we always had confidence in our ability. We felt like we had the best team in North America. And, obviously we put in the practice time and the prep work, and then to go to LAN and lose those matches, it's very disappointing. And, at that point, I suppose a lot of esports players and teams struggle with this as well. Is like, sometimes it could be fickle, where as soon as something doesn't go wrong, you want an instant fix.
Sure.
And that's by recruiting or finding players. So that's what we thought as well. So, if we felt like the teams or some of the players weren't performing, or we felt like we needed to make a change, we did it. There wasn't any.
You're pretty cutthroat, right?
Yeah, it was pretty cutthroat, to be honest.
Yeah.
So, like in particular, Jaden, the Bears, I mean, phenomenal players. Obviously, I got to know them really well, and we practiced and played a lot. But that was our first big LAN event, and we gave them a shot, and we felt like it didn't work out. So, we made a change.
When you say that, though, Rambo, I would say, as much as people might think on a personal level, oh, it's cruel, give them a chance, etc. Like, by the way, these players definitely were good players, and years later they got their results. And obviously, by the way, they were really emotionally hurt by this, and they felt betrayed, etc. But I would just say, if you look at your career, and obviously over in Europe, people like HeatoN and Potti, I actually think if you look at this era, the people who were a bit ruthless tended to be the people who had the best results, though, because in this era, when you only have 1 or 2 big championships to prove yourself at, you can't really burn 2 or 3 hoping people to get it together sometimes, right? You've got to kind of get the lineup that can win the next one in a way, right? It might seem harsh, but I think, again, I think the track record speaks for itself, right? These are the teams and the players that got to the top because you had to make the hard decision sometime.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the essence of competition is it's to win, and that's it. So, at the end of the day, you also got to look at your own goals, and, you want to give people a chance, but there's also an infinite amount of talent pool to select from out there. So, that's what you give your life to. We're practicing all day, every day, and the goal is to win. So sometimes you do have to let your friends go and part ways, but it's competition, and you can only have 5 people. So the teams were just too good back then. So you just have to get the best players.
One thing I always thought was interesting is because you were part of that like elite class of people who'd been at all the big CPL lands and had success already, it felt like you were one of the only era, and by the way, this continues to this day in CS. I've always felt like a lot of top NA players, even if they talk a good game and they trash talk online, a lot of them, if you could sort of like hypnotize them or give them a truth serum, they would admit like they're scared of the best European player. Like in the modern day, I don't know, Simple and Ziwu and people like that. But back then, people like Potti, HeatoN, Element, all the great I actually always got the feeling that the best NA players used to almost have like a bit of a defeatist mentality. If they went to the CPL, if you remember famously, a lot of them even just said, if you just make top 8, that's good. That's what they used to famously say, if you remember, because there were so many good European teams. Wasn't your team one of the few teams that sort of, you actually believed you could beat the best Europeans, right? You believed it was possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt confident in all our players, and we felt like we were the best. And we had results in North America. We're winning all our scrims. We're winning online tournaments. So there was no reason that we feared anyone. And obviously we respected every team we played against, especially the Europeans, because it's like, ooh, foreigners, like we don't really know anything about them. We've never played them before. So. But no, I think I didn't ever feel like we felt not confident or nervous. That's the aura I got, at least for me, because me personally, I knew I put in the practice time and I was always confident. So, but yeah, no, it's always interesting to play versus a team where you don't have much film or study on them and you just kind of play different styles from different countries, whether it's like France, Sweden, China, Brazil. Like everyone has their unique style. So it's kind of like figuring out on the fly.
When in 2002, this Team 3D squad with the changes we've talked about won the CPL, tell me what this moment was like. It had to be a pretty big one.
It's the best feeling in the world. It's, everything you dream of as a pro gamer, all the time we put in, and it's just like, we did it. And just to be able to stand on that podium, hold that trophy, look to your teammates, and just, it's literally, everything you play for. So it's just one of the best feelings in the world.
I have a story I'm going to ask you about, but it's one of these ones where, because I was sort of there, I know the story, so I'll ask you, I'll set it up for you. A lot of people might not know this, Rambo, but I've heard if Team 3D didn't win this CPL or have like a really good finish, the entire history of that organization would be different. Like basically winning that event was the reason all the sponsors came in and the deals came and you got to be pros and have this like I say, like really elevated status. Like, is it true? If this team had bombed this tournament, you think there would have been Team 3D in the same way?
I think so. I think it was very timely and it was a big one. I think it was like the Speakeasy event. There's a lot of great teams there. Fun fact, if anyone knows Torbil or Craig Levine, he's, I think, now co-CEO of ESL Faceit Group.
Yes.
So he's business savant. And he reached out to us, I think he was like 17 or 18 on IRC. He messaged Ksharp and he's like, hey, I want to be your manager. I can get you guys sponsors and jerseys. And we're like, whoa, jerseys and stuff like that. So like, okay, well, sure, why not? So he showed up to, I think that CPL or one of those. And then, he came with like FUBU sponsored jerseys or like 3XL. We're like, oh boy.
Okay.
And then, but then he ended up getting us like Subway sponsorships, like unlimited, cards you could use, NVIDIA, Intel, Subway, CompUSA. So a lot of luck involved, but just, business genius. So ended up being our manager, got us full-time salary where we could, pay for everything, all our trips, all our food, all our hotel. We're doing like promo marketing videos. We did like a 5-city tour in China. So if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have had a career, I don't think. And he was able to support all of us and get us hooked up with sponsors.
Did that impress your parents when you had the full-time salary? Because at the time it wasn't bad money. It was pretty decent for gaming.
Yeah, for sure. It's good for gaming. Obviously, there's prize money as well. So, but, we would get top of line computers, we'd get all hardware and equipment paid for, boot camps, anytime we wanted. So it was a luxury.
Right, one of your teammates, I saved him till now because he was obviously in X3 and Team 3D, is obviously Bullseye. If people remember, his surname was, I think, Morgan. There we go. If everyone remembers all the aliases, I'm just for people who remember the old Frag movies. Right, this is an interesting player. I always thought, Rambo, because to me, I never with the eye test, I never thought he was like as good as you and Ksharp and people like. He wasn't like some crazy fragger to me. But one is like, first of all, he was a really good LAN player. I noticed he was just like really good in clutches, and also this guy back then, people were really antisocial who were gamers. A lot of us were just nerds, and we weren't social butterflies, and we weren't good outside the computer. He seemed like he was always a really chill guy. And that says he had sort of like a glue guy effect, maybe.
Yeah, he was. He lived locally in Dallas, and I probably got introduced to him through some local LAN event. Forget how he joined the team, but just this very normal guy, even keeled, very calm. But he was really consistent. He was really, really consistent. Like you said, very good on LAN, never made mistakes, good communication, hit his shots. One of the biggest, clutchest rounds in our history on CPL Mill, I think it was versus 4K.
Yeah.
He had like a 1-on-3 to force overtime. We ended up winning that. So just, absolutely huge. And, he was an older guy. He was like 4 or 5 years older than us. So he's kind of a bigger brother, kind of, that kind of feel to him. But, just very legit. He wasn't flashy or anything, but he always held his own.
Right. One thing I have to ask you is, in some of the later years, people will know that there was a couple of years for Team 3D that were sort of down years. If people go look at the majors, that you're not like in the semis, you're not making the deep placings. And basically, aside from World Cyber Games, there was a few years where the results weren't that great. That, look, what's weird is if people go back and look at the rosters, the player changes you're making are all good. These are all top players. They're all star rosters. These are the best players in NA, right? In this time period, was there ever a time where you wondered, like, have we lost our ways? Has something gone wrong with the project? Because like I said, to me, what never made sense was the players were fantastic. Nobody was like a shit player or the wrong pick. It's just something about them. Maybe the blend didn't work. What was the issue, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, we won 2 World Cyber Games, and we got a silver and a third in those years. So that was a good kind of glimmering hope for us, and that was a huge international event for us that kind of kept us going. But we did kind of struggle in some of the other events. We got like 4th at ESWC, but yeah, I mean, we were winning online matches and leagues, like the RITD and the Domain of Pain League. There was much like, so we're winning, having success online and LAN, but outside of the World Cyber Games, we were struggling at those events. So to be honest, I don't know what those reasons were. It's just, you'd get it up to other teams, or maybe we just didn't find the flow when we needed to. So, it's hard to recollect individually what happened, but, I was happy that we were able to win those World Cyber Games. It was really good for us.
By the way, I'll ask you about one of these tournaments. So if people remember the 2004 one, the one that was in Condition 0, which to be fair was almost 1.6, it just had some weird things like the nades famously, and the maps looked a tiny bit different. Obviously, the most famous game, the epic one, was the one where you played against HeatoN and Potti in SK Gaming. Like, I've noticed over the years, these were the rivals, right? These were the ones that you wanted to meet in the big match, because it was, you kind of could tell, like, that really was in Counter-Strike. Like, that was like Magic Johnson against Larry Bird type scenario, right? Didn't it mean a lot to play these guys?
Oh, it was huge. It was, I think, the first time we kind of had a rematch with that team. And it was in 2004 in San Francisco, the World Cyber Game Finals. It was a semifinals, and we played them on Inferno. It was a best of 3. So it was that match where Moto had that probably the most insane clutch round, I would say, in Counter-Strike history. Yeah, so he has that box and spot named after him. So if you don't know, it's on Inferno on the A site, and there's like this little box. There's a corner that you could boost someone behind this box, and you could kill the planner. And he was stuck there. It was a 1-on-4. And they tried to plant the bomb. He killed 2, and then he killed the other 2. Literally just jammed and stuck in this box.
The craziest part is the other 2 didn't have to rush him. If they just went away, they'd win the round, wouldn't they? But for some weird reason, they just sort of panicked and rushed him, and he got the kills, didn't he?
Yeah. No, it's like, oh, he's stuck there. We know where he is. Yes. And then it got to them. So it was a huge, absolutely bonkers round. Definitely a shift. And we ended up winning that and kind of getting our revenge. So that felt amazing. Then we went on to play Titans with Zonic on Kabul, I think it was in the finals. And that was a phenomenal team they had too. So, but yeah, that one felt very sweet.
Are you someone, I actually have never asked you this, is that part of your personality I've never asked about. When you win the World Cyber Games, obviously the unique thing, it's actually quite applicable because I've heard a very recent story says actually the Olympics is going to start in gaming. World Cyber Games at the time used to bill itself as the Olympics of gaming because everyone had to be from the same country, obviously. Was it a big deal to you to represent America and win the gold medal? Did it feel like an Olympics vibe?
100%. It's by far my favorite tournament because you actually had to qualify. They would have national qualifiers, and we would fly to New York. We would play all the best teams that qualified, and then when you actually get to the event, it was sponsored by Samsung in Korea. So I remember one of the events in Korea, they rented out the entire Olympics village where they actually had the legit Olympics, and would host the World Cyber Games there. And it was the the commodities and the stay were world class. They would all give us bomber jackets that, you know, in the opening ceremony, you'd have the flags, you'd see like, you know, 55 other countries representing, you know, 6 different games. So it had the whole feel to it from start to beginning. And, you know, it was $50,000 first prize, which was like the highest prize at the time. So it definitely was a huge honor, and it felt like we were representing the nation because you legit had to qualify for it.
Along similar lines, I remember many years later when they had that tournament in Korea, E-Stars Seoul, done by Kan Yang, who obviously me and you know, right? You actually sort of came out of retirement and did commentary there. And famously, even though you're not someone who like speaks Korean fluently or anything, obviously the other side is, if people don't know, Ronald's surname is Kim, probably one of the most famous Korean surnames of all time. Like, what was it actually like to, through esports, sort of like, did you feel like you reconnected with the Korean heritage or got some different side by going there?
Yeah, I mean, it's always nice to visit kind of motherland and see the birthplace of esports. You know, I felt like Korea was ahead of its time. They had already studios broadcasting StarCraft on national TV. So and when you actually showed up there to the events, like the production value, the venues that they were booking at, it's like, okay, well, they know how serious this is, and they didn't really cut any expenses in terms of how the tournaments ran and how they treated the players.
I've got what is, you could say it's controversial, but it's not, because almost no one involved is probably ever going to see this video. Here's a question for you, Rambo. Let's just say back in the day, one of the things I heard a number of times behind the scenes, but I couldn't say publicly because there was no evidence, was when people used to play in the online leagues in North America and you were playing Cal, and these were the top leagues with the top teams, I've heard some people think some of the pros, maybe even pros that were good on LAN, cheated. You think so?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Matches?
Yeah, I mean, there was no anti-cheat back then, and you know, there's a lot of cheats that I heard floating around. So at the time, I didn't really think it, but now, you know, a few years later, looking back, some of the people, you know, in the chats that I'm with, like, they would call each other out. So like, you know, so one, you know, some team in the West Coast, maybe in California.
Yes, certainly, exactly.
Yeah, so they kind of it's, you know, got shared around, but you know, but when I was actually playing, I didn't really think about it or played any differently, or really think, oh, this person's blatantly cheating. Like, I would just all give everyone a benefit of doubt and played everyone the same. But 100% there was cheating going around.
One thing I would ask is, over the years, an interesting angle I wanted to ask you about was, because you were from that original, almost like first generation of NACS pros, that, as I say, you began on LAN. There was never any, I was online phase, or I have to get warmed up, because by the time the big CPLs came, you'd already played tons and tons of LANs. In fact, even in the same venue sometimes. So in the early days, I know actually in the North American scene though, some people did think there was like a divide though, Rambo. They think there was the original class like this who thought they were like the royalty of the scene. And then there was the next class of people like Fraud and the people who came up after Sunman and all these guys, because they all had to go through that phase of like people say you cheat or you're onliner or you're just weird and you can't be in our team. They always had the sense that like your era of player sort of like was a bit elitist and kept them down and wouldn't like acknowledge they were good. I don't know if it was you, but in Team 3D, was there sometimes this sentiment, do you think, of sort of like, we don't need these newer players, or maybe they're not good at, maybe they cheat anyway, and sort of like a bit of like cope, you know?
I would definitely say we had a confidence to us, just because through all the success that we had. I don't know if you'd call it elitist or in a condescending manner, but you know, we wouldn't play certain teams if we knew they wouldn't give us practice. So they did have to be kind of vetted, and you know, sometimes you'd play teams and then maybe they're, I mean, in particular, like that complexity squad, their rapid rise to success was a shock.
Sure.
And we're like, you know, who are these guys? I mean, they're just so good. And when you play versus them, like, you felt it. So it's no surprise they, you know, eventually, I guess they would surpass us for, you know, on later on in that 3D era. And, you know, they just happen to find the perfect role for each of the players. I mean, Fraud, one of the best snipers. Sunman had crazy experience. Storm, he was like the best lurker, defensive player. You had Warden, who was a phenomenal entry player, kind of a glue of the team. And Trip, he was, you know, was a tactical genius and just solid overall. So they find the right pieces. And when I eventually did join them for the CGS, I realized their work ethic and kind of their approach to the game. And then I understood why they were so good. So, but yeah, I mean that whole crew was amazing. I think they're also great for NA. They were just another superpower that can represent.
Yeah, along those lines, I heard when that team first came along, it wasn't like just hype. They really did just scrim more than everyone else. And they actually did, like you're saying, they kind of like scrimmed almost like a modern day team, like properly, like actually run the strats and run the playbook and don't just play gimmicky because it's an online scrim, right? When, as you say, obviously Team 3D was the main other team at the time. Were you impressed by this squad?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we scrimmed them many times. Obviously, we don't want to scrim the kind of rival team too much, so we limited it. But I remember we would play them on Dust 2, and they were just so good on that map. They would have these perfect nades to take long A. Then they would like control take cat and just squeeze A, apply all this pressure, and it was like unstoppable. So they kind of created this meta that we eventually adopted, and I was like, wow, that's really smart. And you know, at some points we're like, yeah, these guys are beating us a little too much. We should not give them this much confidence. So we kind of dodged them sometimes, to be honest. But yeah, they're a phenomenal team.
Right, one player that was a big-time player in Team 3D is obviously Volcano. And if people don't know, he actually had a bigger impact than that. Like, he was part of why the map Cash exists in CSGO. And if you know the game Valorant, he was behind Valorant. So he actually had some really big impact after his career. But when he came to your team, I remember he was like the young guy, right? He was one of those up-and-comers. Who was Volcano?
Yeah, Volcano, Sal, we recruited him from Zex at the time. And he's this kid from New York, just very quiet, calm, soft-spoken. And I forget who recommended him. It was maybe Ksharp or something. But once he joined, I was like, dude, this guy is he has no weakness. He's like a 9 out of 9 in every skill category. One of my favorite teammates of all time. Like, never showed up late to practice. Great communicator, amazing, skillfully mechanically. Never made a mistake. Played fearless. So I would put him in my top 5 list of all the players that I played with, and he's just super intelligent. Yeah. So he co-created Cash. I think he developed probably like all the maps for Valorant, or he's definitely like the lead level designer. So he has this very strong understanding of games mechanics, angles, spacing and timing, how maps work. So he has this innate ability of, how to play games and how to design them from that kind of architectural standpoint. So, honestly, I can't say enough good things about him.
One player I know that you wanted to play with for many years, I mean, the joke later on is you sort of got baited. You were supposed to join Call Together, was obviously Method. So obviously you got him after NOA, right? This is a guy you wanted to play with for years, right? You say like you kind of vibed with him for some reason?
Yeah, so I guess it's been enough time, but I'll share it. I don't want to call him out, but Method messaged me and he's like, hey, do you want to join Complexity with me? And for the championship gaming series, it's like, this was in 2007. We had just lost the CPL. Complexity was on their rise. I think they got first or second. They did really well. And this whole new league called the Championship Gaming Series by DirecTV was being formed. And it's like this huge hype, huge salaries, the most ever. You live in Los Angeles, luxury apartments, we're on national TV. It's like franchise, there's like cities, Dallas, Los Angeles and all that. So he's like, hey, you want to join Complexity with me? And I was like, thought about it. And I was like, I felt like at that time that some of the players just weren't putting in the time. And, this was a time for a change. So I said, yeah, I'll join Complexity with you. So I spoke with Jason Lake, signed the contract, and then Method messaged me. He's like, hey, I don't want to join anymore. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that was awkward. But I was still confident in my decision that this was the right choice if I wanted to win. I felt like this was the players I wanted to live with. And, we ended up actually all moving to Dallas, Texas, like the first time in North America that I know of where all 5 players lived in a house and trained together. Sure. And that's something I wanted to do that I couldn't do with the other team. So yeah, we all 5 of us moved to Dallas. We picked up Zet from Sweden, Fraud, Storm, Warden. So it was all 5 of us. And it was amazing. We won the Championship Gaming Series, Counter-Strike individual event. We won for an entire year. We didn't lose a single match on LAN. So it was just incredible playing with those guys. It was, just all-star talent.
Right, obviously that was in Source because it was CGS. Before that, when you played with Method in 1.6 in 3D, what was he like in 1.6? He looks like another player that's probably insane in scrims, I'm assuming.
Oh my gosh, yeah, he's a machine. I would say he's the closest thing to an aimbot that I've ever seen.
Okay.
Right, so just the cleanest headshots, best recoil control, one of the fastest reaction times, and one of the best anchor players. So if you're ever attacking his site, like if you didn't flash him 4 or 5 times, he's going to kill everyone. So when we made the change, we picked up Shagwire and Method at the time because we needed 2 NA players, and they had just played for NOA, and they were killing it. I think they won a couple events, and so they were a clear, easy choice, like a duo pickup. And Method again, just aimbot. Shagwire, I would say. I mean, now at one point he was the best online poker player in the world after he retired from gaming.
He had a lot of success, yeah.
Yeah, so no surprise there because his play style is so trolly. It's just, like, dude, what are you doing? Is you just get under your skin, find the craziest timings, you would backstab, push through smoke, whatever it is. And he just had this phenomenal ability to see windows of opportunities and take gambles and read and predict players, which are like all skill sets that I believe you need in poker. So it's no surprise to me. He's just a super, and it just had this ability to think differently and, again, take those windows of opportunity.
Right, I definitely need to ask about the second World Cyber Games gold medal, the one that was in 2005, because the backstory on this one is just so mad, Ronald. So first of all, even though it was announced that the grand finals were in CS Source, which was a new game at the time, they allowed the regional qualifiers to be played in 1.6, which is like... So already, if you were like a Source team, good luck. You're not qualified. It's going to be like Team 3D or fucking Complexity or Rival or something. It's going to be the 1.6 team. But then, even if you qualify, you have to then play a Source at the LAN. And at the LAN, some of the teams might be better in Source. It might be what? Give me the backstory. It must have been very weird because essentially you guys only practiced Source for this tournament, right? You only played it a bit, right?
Yeah. Actually, didn't remember that the qualifiers in 1.6 compared to Source. So at the time we were still playing 1.6, so we were confident in that. And then when we knew we had to qualify for or play the Singapore event in Source, it was a whole new grind because the physics of that game is completely different. The movement, even the recoil, it was completely different. So we started scrimming the best teams in North America. And at that time, I think Powers Gaming was the best team. Had like Mo and Clown and Trevor was his name. I forget his alias, but we just grinded with them, and they were actually a huge reason why we were able to win Singapore because they taught us everything. They taught us all the little, nuances, little OP spots, and if it wasn't for them, honestly, probably wouldn't have won Singapore. So that really helped us catch up to the meta and the physics of the game. And
then for people who don't know, there was a time period between that and before CGS where in 2006, even though I said before there wasn't that many good results outside, this was the year when you had the run back again. Like you were in the WSVG making it to the finals. Like you had a run at SWC where you guys were pretty good. World Cyber Games was even half decent. You were playing against the team that won, etc. That was. Did you feel like at the end of this 1.6 period, was there like a renaissance period, do you think? Yeah. That's when we picked up Shagwire and Method. And then Moto was also our 6-man / kind of coach. And I felt like that roster was amazing. There was also, it was Volcano, me, Dominator, Stevers. Yeah. So it was really good crew. So we won the World Series of Video Games. And yeah, I mean, we were doing really well. So I think Method and Shagwire at the time were like top 15 players in the world. So just having those two players immediately made a huge impact. We rode that honeymoon phase where you have like this new team, this new roster, everyone, just whole new energy and hype. So those guys, I would probably say with him and obviously Volcano on the team is just one of my favorite rosters of all time. Since you referenced him, Severs, which is the surname, Dominator, he was one of those players, like I was referring to before, Rambo, where when he came up, we all just thought, probably just cheats, doesn't he? He's too good. Who the fuck is this guy? He's a random guy who's playing like Team Stomping Grounds. You remember, like, who the fuck is this guy? He was just like, but actually, as people saw in Team 3, he was just a really good player, right? I noticed an interesting thing with him. Maybe you can give me some background. Is I actually did an interview with him like 4 or 5 years ago, and what's interesting about him was he didn't actually seem like the traditional nerd. He almost seemed more like a jock, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think Volcano was an introduction from him for Sievers, and we gave him a chance. And he was, yeah, I mean, he was like, you know, this buff jack dude, the opposite of what you would imagine a gamer be.
Yes.
Just really chill guy, you know, nothing nerdy about him, but he was very competitive. You know, he's an athlete and phenomenal aim, just great energy, you know, super hype. He's always pumping the team up. You know, yelling and screaming, you know, not in a bad way, but, you know, just getting us hyped up. So yeah, he brought that extra energy to us that we kind of needed. Everyone else was kind of introverts. But no, he was really good and just, you know, great pistol player, great rifler, and that's kind of what we needed at the time. Not someone that like, you know, would op or do something crazy, but hey, just hold your spot, you know, show up to practice, perform on LAN, bring good energy. And he had all that. You know, he wasn't, I wouldn't say elite world class, but he was really good, really, really good, and exactly the type of player we needed.
One thing when I was thinking of old things for this interview, like what will we talk about, I actually realised it's crazy how iconic like some of the memes were back then, and almost all of them involved your teams, Ronald. Like there was obviously like just use Ksharps for the config. You remember that stupid one? Then there was that one where Jaguar, that CGI thing was like, what up now, Swedes? Woo! Or whatever. Like that was like in your team. There was the fucking, what was the other one? There was the one obviously at that CPL you won, like whose org, that was you, whose org is this? Yeah. Like there was so many iconic quotes back in the day, you remember?
Yeah, that was a funny moment. There's actually the domain whoseorgisthis.com.
All right, okay.
That Sickness told me about, and if you ever want to go look back at some of the pictures of old school tournaments, that's what they named it.
That's dope. That's a good idea. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, but I mean the story behind that is the only person that used an AUG was Bullseye on my team. Like literally the only person that used it. So, you know, I was in the moment. I was like, whose AUG is this? Like, why? Oh, okay. Well, there's literally only one person that uses it. So it turned into a meme.
By the way, I want to ask you a question, but I've got to give you a setup first to give you an excuse to give the real answer, Rambo. Right? Your problem is, as a person, like you're a really reserved person. You're not like a braggadocious individual, etc. So I'll tell you a quick story, right? You know the player Neo from Poland, like the legendary 1.6 player, right? If I ever talked to him in 1.6 though, Rambo, he would always tell me like, no, don't say I'm the best player. I think Forrest is better than me. You know, I'm just a good player. And, you know, my teammates are great and we all try. But here's what's funny. When CSGO came around, he was still in a very good team, but he himself wasn't as good. Like, he was never the best player in CSGO. And I noticed when I interviewed him in CSGO, and I was sort of like, now that you're not as good in CSGO, you were pretty fucking good in 1.6. And he said like, oh yeah, now I realize I was insane. Like, because it's like he was only being humble because he had the luxury of doing that. He was so good. Everyone knew he was good. So I would ask you the question in the same way, Rambo, which is if I just asked you, were you the best NACS 1.6 player? You're a pretty humble guy, but I mean for real, inside your mind, when you played back then, did you think you could beat anyone? Could you win everything? Could you be the best player? Were you the best player?
In my mind, okay, there was a point about 6 to 8 months in that period where I felt like I was the best player in the world in my mind, in my confidence, because there was that period where my aim felt so perfect. At that time, I'd had all the experience. So in my mind, I felt like I was the best because I was also playing like 12 hours a day. So it was just, you know, but I would say for me, I felt like I was the most consistent player on LAN for the longest period of time.
Right.
So I wasn't the best mechanically. I wasn't the best sniper, pistol player. I wasn't the best strat caller, but I felt like when it came down to it, I won the rounds I needed to. And I was able to make an impact for that long period of time.
Even when you say that, though, I think you almost downplay yourself too much. When you say you weren't the best in each area, yeah, but I'll use like what you said about Volcano. If we're doing out of 10, like in a lot of areas, you were probably an 8 or a 9 out of 10. You had a very well-rounded game, right? You could use all the weapons.
I could use all the weapons. I didn't really op much because back then it wasn't really common to double op.
No, of course.
And I had Ksharp as well, so So,
and you were a clutch player. You won a lot of clutches too.
Yeah, I won a lot of clutch rounds. I won the rounds that I needed to. The biggest and my favorite clutch was in World Cyber Games Singapore. It was on Inferno. It was versus K23 from Kazakhstan.
Okay.
The one with Hobbit and Adren that would go on to win the majors in one point in CS. The other later versions of CS. And there was this that round I did op. I had the best spawn in Inferno. It was like 13-11 or something, you know, like last 2 rounds. And I had the best spawn. I was like, so went for the banana pick, got that op. Ended up winning a 1-on-2 or 1-on-3 in A site. So that was my best clutch. But no, I was just like, you know, I obviously when you put in like thousands and thousands of hours and all those hundreds of land experience hours on experience, like you get pretty good. So yeah, I just felt like I was really good when the time mattered on land.
Everyone needs a support network, and mine is, of course, my Patreon community, the Scrominati, who, in many ways, they're the Sonny to my Cher, saying, I got you, babe. So this video and all the others on my channel were kindly supported by the following names: Ahmed Hadju, Mac Pugnaccio Rakula, Adam Tomlin, Animosity, Jensen Go, Tosh, Toucan, and you know it. Jerky's Minion, my main man, always going to be referenced, one of the best patrons of all time. Would you like to ask a question in my AMA? Maybe you want to suggest a topic or a guest to say on my channel. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming Reflections and Talk to Thorin interviews are. Maybe you want to do one of those long discussions where you get to set the topics we talk about. Well, if any of these or others appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Scluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.